welcome you to the single most comprehensive topic that explains the most paranormal and so-called conspiracy theories in one fell swoop. As we explore this over time, you will learn an alternative history of planet Earth that most of the whistleblowers who told us about were either shut down, like Admiral Byrd was, or killed, like William Milton Cooper was. Those who kept the atom bomb secret before World War II were considered national heroes. Those that keep the secret space black ops secret consider themselves heroes as well. Okay, I have always had anomalies, but they didn't make sense until an NSA crew deliberately used my Remember code for my main altar in April of 2013. They were murdered for their trouble in 2016 after I went public to save my life. I was being shot at. And I am only one of hundreds of thousands of people with memories. There are millions of us who have served in these black ops only to have our minds wiped and be returned to civilian life. If you have no experience with the topic, this will be your introduction. We will be going through the subjects related, the agencies currently involved, and a brief history of the factions already entrenched in space and their agendas. Along the way, we will talk about technology, science, mind control techniques, extraterrestrials, and interdimensionals. All through history, there have always been people who were different, who talked about wars in space, or interacting with beings that weren't of the normal Earth variety, from elves and fairies to demons to angels to everything in between. I have been digging through the layers even before my memories were activated, and I am now on layer 9 of the rabbit hole. And every time I think I am to the bottom of it, a big chunk of the floor falls through, dumps me into another layer. So yeah, it's like I look around and I see things very differently than other people, but most of it's based on this research I keep doing. Yeah, it is a totally different worldview. But once you really see it, you can't go back. My whole life, I have known that what the mainstream view was wrong, that it was a lie. And I've always been what they called a dissident because I knew. And I've dug through and pointed out anomalies that proved it was a lie. And people just basically patted me on the head and said, you're a conspiracy theorist and blah, 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 blah. Well, now I remember why I'm weird. And everything that I have different hangs together. And more and more and more evidence is coming out to support I'm telling the truth as I know it.
Good.
Now, some of the stuff may be off base because, if they do one layer of cover memories, they may be doing a second,
Mm-hmm.
But the entire thing that I was kidnapped, I was put through this shit, I have altars for the rest of my life, and that I was used in military-related black ops, that's true. Now, I have friends on Facebook who are trying to tell me that what I remember happening is just virtual reality and it was all done in a cave. And I'm like, no, there's too many ETs involved, and they were physical beings that died when I shot them. The story starts in ancient history with demigods and heroes who were noted as not their father's children. All of humanity has stories about their nation's great heroes who performed feats of courage, strength, or cunning, but had a dark side, a side with bouts of madness. Well, the super soldier programs have been going on back to the days of the Anunnaki. It's only since the Germans that humans have been in charge of the super soldier programs. That's part of the problem with humans, is that we've not been left alone to be who we are. We've been deliberately bred to be super soldiers in ET armies. So a lot of our character flaws were deliberately inbred into us to fight their wars in space or on Earth. Those soldiers were the demigods or heroes of mythology. Today we call them super soldiers. What is different now is that humans are creating the super soldiers instead of extraterrestrials. This is very new and recent in our history. This technology was acquired from the Anunnaki in the 1800s, first by the Germans and then the Americans. The original scientists were working for the Bavarian Illuminati, which is very real and still active today. I need to state here that they are not the only group that is called Illuminati, nor are they the most powerful. There are at least 30 factions that are in that web, and they have formed shifting alliances in their quest for ultimate control. At this point, none of these groups have ultimate control, or at least none that I've located. In the 1800s, the Prussian Empire was allied with the United States, supporting the Union against the Confederacy and Great Britain. I still have not found the documentation for the shift of the American alliance from Germany to Britain, but I know it took place during the Teddy Roosevelt administration. There have been many cryptic references to our special relationship since then, and none before. A decade or so later, President Wilson instituted the Federal Reserve central banking system and an income tax to support it, and came into World War I on the side of Britain and France. Okay, the history of their space program started in the 1600s. Okay, there was a man in England called John Dee. He's known today as being the father of Enochian magic. And he kept getting into trouble with both the Catholic and the Anglicans for practicing magic, because mathematics was a form of magic as far as the church was concerned. And he was a gifted mathematician. And he worked with Mercator, who came up with the map grid system. And he traveled Europe extensively. But he had run across this guy, Edward Kelly, and the two of them had made contact with interdimensionals that they thought were angels. And in exchange for blood offerings, these angels would give the mysteries of the universe. Well, when he eventually got into too much trouble in Bohemia, which I guess is today's Czech Republic, he ended up going back to England and living with his daughter. But his assistant, Edward Kelly, ended up in Prussia with all this tech and how to contact these interdimensionals. So in the 1800s, not far from where I live, there was a Sonora Aero Club, which were Prussian scientists and engineers who were working on how to stabilize a product they called red mercury. So in the 1880s, 1890s, you will find in newspaper accounts UFO sightings starting in California and going east. Now, Zeppelins are notoriously difficult to steer. So they were having a really hard time getting home. And I don't know how they made that flight across the Atlantic going home. But they ended up across the Atlantic. And that brings us up to just before World War I, when the Tula Society was contacted by the Vril Society, who were women. And these women were doing the same sorts of contacting interdimensionals that Edward Kelly had done. Maria Orsich was their leader, and her father was in the Tula Society. And Victor Schauberger is who invented, or was given credit for inventing, the anti-grav engine. So Maria Orsich's group, and usually you only hear about 2 of them, but there were 6 of them. And they were all doing this. They all had hair down as far as it would grow. But they were contacting several interdimensional and ET races. And they channeled instructions for a ship. Automatic writing is something that is in the paranormal field. And it's where you go into a trance and you just start writing, and you don't know what you're writing, it's just coming out. It's almost like someone else is running your hand. That's how these ladies got these instructions. And they were blueprints, but they were in a language that none of them spoke. So Maria went to her dad, who arranged a meeting with men from the Tula Society. They had people who could translate it. It was a variant of Sumerian, because the Tula and the Anunnaki had been working together. And the Anunnaki were who went all over the ancient world looking for these ancient documents. They were who found, it was one of the Vedas that gave a description on how to build a Vimana and how to fly it. So they already had that in Sanskrit. So these guys translated it for her. And then somehow Hitler got word of it before World War II and tried to nationalize it. And because these ladies were aristocracy, they basically told him to piss off. And he started in, well, I can just have you arrested. And they said, no, you can't. So it turned into a power struggle. And the ladies won. But Hitler's people, the scientists, were able to come and watch the construction and make copies of the blueprints. And so what Hitler had going were copies of what the ladies were still producing on their own. They did not want Hitler to have them because they did not want war taken into space. And I know that does not fit anything that people think about the Germans, but this was what they really said. We do not want this. And that was why the Hanabu were not ready when Hitler was losing the war, is because these women were not cooperating at all. And they had the original instructions. And they had never even bothered to try to figure out how to attach weapons to them. So they had running ships, but they had not figured out how to have a weapon that didn't spin with the ship. That was a major engineering issue for the Third Reich, was to attach an engine to a ship that makes the whole thing spin, but you want to have guns that don't. The Nazi Party was like the Democrats or the Republicans or the Bull Moose Party. It was a political party for a 2-decade era in a certain specific time in history, and it did not go into space. Now, what did go into space were German aristocracy who had been trained in a Teutonic Knight mindset. Germany had ongoing experiments from the work done in the 1800s regarding the creation of super soldiers. They continued their work in secret, and the Americans stopped when they started working with the British. During and right after World War I, the Germans were creating clones as soldiers. There was an entire brigade of these clone soldiers who served in World War II. These were not projects of the Weimar Republic, but were sponsored by aristocratic secret societies, in particular the Thule and Frill Gesellschaften. So, as long as the World War II German regime followed the instructions of the aristocracy, things went well for them. But when egos swelled and instructions were ignored, the aristocracy realized that the war and the nation were lost. They moved to a location discovered in Antarctica, an underground base in Queen Maud's Land. Submarines ferried personnel, supplies, and the most secret technologies to this base, named Neuschwabenland after the ship that discovered the underground base. The nation of Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. Neuschwabenland and the aristocracy did not surrender. It was at this point that they became separate entities. The Germans in space are not the German nation on Earth. And people need to keep that in mind, because from this point out, we're talking about the German breakaway civilization. We are no longer talking about Germany. Okay, after World War II, the American government first thought they had won World War II and then found out they didn't in 1946. The Battle of Operation High Jump, where Admiral Richard Byrd came into Antarctica and thought he was going to wipe out the last nest of the Germans. Only they beat him. And he had to go back and tell Congress that they beat him. And they avoided signing the peace treaty until 1953, when President Eisenhower finally signed it. Okay, we need to understand the German country did a full unconditional surrender. It was just this one breakaway group in Antarctica that won. And their winning did not affect their home country. So the structure is the Germans that were in Antarctica and are now in space are the people who beat the United States. And because Germany surrendered to the United States, they are now under the United States. And in fact, the German nation has never been given a peace treaty. They are an occupied nation. So the folks out in space have told their own people that Earth was hit with a cobalt war and will not be inhabitable for 10,000 years. So they're staying away and leaving everybody alone, which was part of the terms of their peace treaty with the United States, was they would not interfere, but they required 150,000 Americans be turned over to them every year to serve in their military or for other purposes. They were hoping that these people would want to stay and become colonists in their colonies. They were looking for genetic diversity. I got my memories back because an NSA agent used my remember code from my mind fracture. And so I got all the memories back from one altar, but they were all in a big lump, and they were all in German, and they were, the more traumatic things were on the top and out of order. So it required a lot of sifting and taking each memory as itself, its own thread, and pulling that thread out of the rest to find out what it was I was remembering from the beginning to the end of that thread. And then putting it into a timeline and figuring out what went before and what went after as well as I could. And a lot of these, I still don't speak German well enough to know what they're talking about. So I did lots and lots and lots and lots of research. And because when I was activated, I was suddenly lucid 24/7, I was doing 20 hours a day of research for years. And the research was in consciousness and in where could I possibly have been in a battle with raptors, because that was the first memory on the top of the pile, was raptors breaking into a room with a bunch of children who spoke German. I know that did not happen on Earth. And so that was what I was working with, was the paranormal experiences that immediately came when I was activated, and the memories that were all in German, and figuring out what I was remembering and how old was I in the memory and who was I interacting with and what the technology was and what the animals were. I still don't speak German well enough to understand the dialogue. So I'm still operating from the peripherals, the sensory, rather than the language. And I think I've done a half decent job because what I've come up with makes sense when I talk. But basically what I've done is applied logic to what I see and interact with. And I'm trying to learn enough German to understand the discussion, except it's in a dialect. It's in Schwabisch instead of in Hochdeutsch. Hochdeutsch is High German, is what they teach in school, and it's very hard to find a way to learn a dialect. And I know they're speaking a dialect. And by 2014, I was starting to watch the videos. And Randy Kramer's experiences on Mars were the closest to what I remembered. Not exactly right, because I didn't remember being in the battles. I was not in the same faction he was. Yep. So the memories were different, but the overall picture was the closest to his.
Okay.
So I thought, okay, all right. This is what we're talking about. And then I read Michael Ralph's
website,
Yep.
and the two books he has on there. And I thought, okay, that pretty much narrows it down to Mars.
Mm-hmm.
I had been a devout Christian before, but all of that, just all of my Christian faith just fell away. It was like, I don't believe that crap. And I still remember believing it. I still remember all the decades of Christian study that I did. And it was like a light switch had been flipped off. It was gone.
I was picked up by the CIA, the American CIA. They had me for 5 years. Okay. First 2 years were mind fracture.
The mind fracturing techniques were taken from the Bavarian Illuminati, or what most Americans know as satanic ritual abuse. It's the idea is that if you torture an adult, they go catatonic or just scream forever, or they die, and you have lost a useful asset. If you torture a child, it forms a bubble in its mind that stores the trauma away from the main personality. And they can create endless numbers of these through torture.
Only young children, age 7 or younger, have this ability. It's a survival function from before civilization, meant to allow children to survive the deaths of their families by often violent means. Over time, those bubbles forget there was another person. Then they start developing into people of their own with no shared memory. The original person only notices missing time. Well, the experts at the CIA knew how to access those bubbles and start training them to respond to commands. Each bubble became an altar over time, with code words to call it to the front, to order actions, to put it back to sleep, and Omega programming, the orders to self-destruct the entire person. Alters start off with the same basic stuff as the original person, but with the memory of the torture. They're not demons or anything from outside the person. They are fragments of a fractured mind.
Some of them even think they're a different gender from the body. They can speak different languages, be taught different skills, but they don't share memory. So if you want someone to commit a major crime and you don't want them to be able to testify against you for setting them up for it, then this is the perfect alibi, because that way the person who's actually doing the crime doesn't even remember doing it or who told them to do it. This is the classic MKUltra description of the Manchurian candidate that goes through and is a perfect person and then suddenly kills a bunch of people.
Their first project was to produce a 13 by 13 by 13 cubic array of altars. Their intention was to make it where my mind was like a subdivided computer that they could access different parts and the rest would not know what it was.
So they only trained one to say, kill people with their mind. And all of the sub-alters would learn it from that one. This was standard operating procedure. So that when you add it up, it's just under 2,200 alters.
The CIA were using the traditional techniques that are at least 5,000 years old from the Moloch worshippers. Now, if you look them up, that's the Canaanite god that accepted baby sacrifice. To that extent, they are in the category that most people call Satanist, but they're really not. They're not, you know. Satan, as we know him, is a creation of the Roman Catholic Church. I'll just say that. He has no actual reality, except in the magic community, they refer to egregores, which are thought forms that take on a life of their own from the energy people invest in them. The Catholic clergy needed a boogeyman, someone to scare you with so that you would do what they said, give them your money. The Minotaur of Crete is related to the Minotaur known as Moloch from Phoenicia. They're not the same dude, but they're related. They're from the same race of ET. And they both had human sacrifice, blood offerings. When I was 4 years old, it was the summer of 1959. They came into my house and they got me. And they put me into a Jeep with, there were a couple of other kids, there were military people. They were wearing green fatigues and the Jeep was green, and we traveled at night. And there were tunnels underground, and there were these overhead bare light bulbs. And when you were under one, you could barely see the next one. Yeah. And they were not supposed to use headlights. They were just supposed to drive by the drop lights. And so we went as far as the tunnels went, and the rest of the time we drove on the old Route 66. But it was all at night. And it took several days to get from Central California, where I was, to Langley, Virginia. There's an Air Force base there. And in 1959, they were still building the CIA main headquarters. So I was kept in the basement of another building on the base. And at 4 years old, I could barely read. So I remember the sign out front. So I know it said Langley Air Force Base. They already considered me an asset because they had been following my mother and her family long enough that they knew the family background, and they had contacted the family doctor. So when Mom was pregnant, they abducted her and shot me and my twin sister up with Draco DNA because they wanted certain psychic abilities that normals don't have. The process of doing this killed my twin sister. So she was born dead. But by the time I got to Langley, they did a mind wipe. So then I no longer remembered my family. I have seen photographs of myself from before the age of 4. I know I existed. I know I was part of this family. I know these are my parents. I know this is where I was born. I have no memories of them before this. And they shaved my head because they were going to use, it was a set of electrodes that were formed into like almost like a helmet, except it was just the framework of the electrodes tied together. And hair got in the way of it. As an adult looking back on it, we probably had 3 or 4 levels of research going on at the same time on the data that they were producing from the group of us. So they had a background in secret society ritual abuse. So they were applying what they today call a satanic ritual abuse in a science setting. So the ritual part was gone. It was just the abuse part. So I have a slightly different experience than a lot of the people out there. I was given a number. It was the number of my room. I was number 7. And 2 doors down, there was a boy, and his name on earth was Stephen, and his number was 5. And that will turn out to be important because number 5 grew up to be the NSA agent who activated my memories. And they chose him to do it because they knew I would trust him. So, long, convoluted story. Now, so I was this tiny, tiny little girl, now with a shaved head, and they put me basically in solitary. I was in a room the size of, well, you've seen the children's cots that they sell, the children's beds. That was the length of the room. You come in the door, and the room was wide enough for that bed to be across the back wall. And the only window was in the door so that they could see what I was doing because they didn't want us sitting and rocking. And next to the door, there was a sink with no mirror and a toilet. And, we're talking less than 6 by 6. And this was my cell for the 5 years I was there. Now, at that point in 1959, okay, remember, we're talking about 60 years ago, okay, they had a regeneration tank from the Germans in space. So they didn't care if they killed us or not physically because they could dump us in the tank and bring us back. That was one of the things that they were trying to instill in us, was that death was not an option, that no matter what we did, we had to follow orders because we weren't allowed to die. You could die, but you weren't going to stay dead. You were going to wake up in that tank. They're not human technology. The Germans got them from the Mantids. So the Germans knew they were going to get the survivors of the program that I was in. And so they provided one regen tank to Langley. And it was for us. It's a tank that's 2 meters across and 3 meters deep. And there's like a hook in it. And they just hang your body from the hook. There's a computer, looks like a tablet on the outside, and they can set it for any age or weight. And if you've been dead less than a week, you come back with full memory. And they can bring you back from the dead up to 4 months, but the longer they wait, the less memory you have. So if they're bringing you back and it's 3.5, 4 months, what they get back is a zombie. And they have to retrain it. Okay. So they prefer fresh bodies.
They could bring us back with full memory of them having killed us. So there is no fear of death. Actually, most of us kind of welcome the eventual death because that's the only freedom we ever get. Most of the altars have no ethical compass at all. They're basically a blank slate that holds the memory of a torture. And they fill it with whatever they want. And generally anything like ethics or values or caring about people is not what they want you to have.
So, okay. The first thing they did to break us was drown us. They were teaching us to breathe underwater because you have to breathe the gel in the regen tank. Once they got to where that no longer created an altar, then they moved to what the Moloch worshippers did, which was rape and sodomy. I have memories of being raped at 4 by adult men, more than one, because they had to up the ante every time to continue to mind fracture. That's what this process is called, is mind fracturing. When that stopped working, they proceeded to sodomize me. Same thing, adult men, and I was still 4 or 5 years old. Okay. I have memories of being locked inside a vault, basically a old style refrigeration unit, and left to suffocate, sometimes with other children. I've been nailed inside a wall and left to suffocate. I've been nailed inside a wall that had a passageway that I was expected to crawl through the walls and the ceiling and find the path to a cabinet door that would let me out. So there was some teaching involved in some of this. I had nightmares of crawling through the walls for decades before my memories were restored. So when the memory of what happened at Langley was restored, the nightmares I'd had for decades finally made sense. But what these folks do is they clear your memory, but they don't clear your subconscious. So the memory comes bubbling back up. And you have to deal with it at some point, but you have to know what the actual memory was before you can clear it. Once I remembered this, the nightmare made sense, went away. If you look in the psychology manuals, the shrinks trying to figure out how to treat DID, dissociative identity disorder, which is the clinical term for what's wrong with us. Okay? The shrinks that are working on that have found that when they run across a child in the wild with DID, that it is almost always related to sexual abuse. So if you're looking at somebody on the street, you know, your neighbor's kid, somebody like that, if they're showing obvious alters, they're being sexually abused. You can take that to the bank. That's one way that people can tell. Either that or the CIA had them, which is the same difference because they sexually abuse them too. I'm going to make it clear. What they did to us was so extreme. 80% of us died the first year. Not dead in a body where the regeneration tank could bring us back. Dead in our minds, given up, catatonic, nothing left. And those kids were dumped into the incinerator. There were at least 1,000 kids when I got there. The regeneration machine does not fix broken minds. It only fixes broken bodies. And I have no idea why they were allowed to have those kinds of losses. I mean, it's not very practical whenever you're destroying 80% of your product.
But my understanding from other veterans of these programs is that by 1980 that they had stopped doing the extreme mind fracture, that they were only doing like 30 altars each. They would get really concerned if I sat and rocked, because that was a sign of going catatonic. That was, the mind was giving up. They wanted you to want to live, but they wanted to break you.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'd be in the room for the whole day, for the whole week. And then they would come in the middle of the night and yank you out and do crap to you and plop you back into the room if they hadn't killed you, or put you in a regen tank. And when you came out, they'd hose you off, put you in fresh PJs, and put you back in your room. Sometimes they would bring you food in your room. Sometimes they'd let you starve. We would occasionally be in a cafeteria space.
Okay.
We were not allowed to interact. But we would be in the cafeteria together. And that's how I knew that Steve had been there. I watched them come into a group of us in the cafeteria where we were supposed to be quietly eating, and they would just shoot somebody. And that somebody would wake up in the regen tank, and the next day they would be back with us. It was a constant time of, you never knew what was going to happen to you. You had no control over your life. You had no idea about time. You had no anything. And everything was white. The walls were white. The floors were white.
Yeah.
Our pajamas were white. There was no color. There was no anything. It was simply, we were there. We were there to be mind fractured. We were there to be tortured. And they enjoyed it. The people in charge were sadistic. They enjoyed what they did to us. The day-to-day people that were carrying out their orders were cold and clinical, like this was just another day's work. The people involved with the mind fracture and weaponization were all human. And I've had lots and lots and lots and lots of people balk at that. They want to think it's reptilians, but it's not. It's humans. There were several ETs around. Most of them were Mansids or Greys. And yes, and there were people probably in the same building, several stories up, who had no clue this was going on at all. They were going about their normal lives. The people who are running the CIA, or were when I was at Langley, were normal appearing humans. Some were Americans, some were Germans, but they had, the average human intelligence is defined at being 100, and these people were close to 200. They were incredibly smart and had no compassion at all. None. I've been treated better by Draco than I ever was by those people. They enjoyed torturing small children. It was like this was their dream job. My experience at Langley was not something I would wish on my worst enemy. That's the honest truth. And if they are still doing anything of the sort to anyone, it should be stopped. I've had people from other factions tell me it's been stopped. that it was considered a waste of prime assets because so many of us died. And I would agree with that assessment. But in the SSP group, I have too many young people in their 20s coming to me with similar memories for me to believe that it stopped. And these are not just Americans. These are from all over the world.
So what is the result for this activity? 1, the CIA wanted to have deniability for kidnapping children for Black Ops service. Kidnapping and mind fracturing children is illegal, as is killing over 80% of them. These are capital felonies, and the CIA didn't want us to be able to testify against them. 2, the CIA wanted to sell altars to other agencies to raise money. Most of their projects are hidden from Congress, and they always want more money. Over the years, the CIA has trafficked drugs, weapons, and humans. The practice of selling altars is just part of the trafficking humans continuum. 3, the Department of Defense wanted access to some of these altars. They didn't want the CIA to have access to the memories of what the altar did for them. An altar that can only be accessed by the agency they work for is the perfect spy or courier, recording and transferring information while the original person is completely unaware and innocent and can pass a polygraph. 4, there are factions in the space Black Ops, and some are at war with each other. And each of these groups wanted total secrecy from the others. So what we have are some spy reasons for torturing small children to create dissociatives for use by multiple agencies over the course of the children's lifetimes. And it was worth it to them, even if 80% of us died the first year. Now, that process of creating that cubic array of altars took about a year and a half. And when I had the required number of altars, I was put in the car with 2 adults and total of 4 children. And we were driven from Langley, Virginia to Montauk, Long Island, New York. And we were there for 6 months. Now, the Montauk program that everyone knows about started in the late 70s. I was there in 61, 62. And at that time, it was being used by the CIA for the kids that were going into space. At that point, if you survived mind fracture, you had to survive Montauk. And out of the 4 kids that in my group, I was the only one who came back. And they had this thing about if you didn't cooperate, if you didn't work out, they would just toss you alive into the incinerator. These were not nice people. I was just tired of this. This was like constant torture. While I was at Montauk, I was kept in an electrified cage because they, right before they would take you to do something, they would torture you so that you would be in this heightened awareness state where your psi abilities worked better. And that was their reasoning for it. But at the time, I was a 6-year-old kid. And this was pure hell From my point of view, it was just as bad or worse than Langley. And this had been ongoing now for close to 3 years by the time I was done there. And I was refusing to cooperate with the assigned mission, which was to travel back to a general store somewhere in the western United States in approximately 1880. And I was supposed to be stealing an apple from the display outside. They were testing the butterfly effect, which that's a time travel theory that the theory goes that if you go back in time and you step on a butterfly, that you change the future because that butterfly matters. Well, we found that for most individuals, that's not true. That there are key individuals in any species that you can't kill them without there being changes. That everybody else is more or less filler. It's not that their lives don't matter, it's that they don't matter to the history stream. So a lot of people really don't want to hear that. I used to think I was one of the people that didn't matter, and I was okay with that. It took a lot of responsibility off me. It's okay. I can live my life, do what I want, because I'm not going to affect the future. Except apparently I do affect the future because they keep trying to shut me up. So they've figured out who most of the key humans have been over the past 300 or so years. And the CIA has made a game out of messing with the timeline to give themselves more power. Did you know the American South actually won the Civil War? They did. And eventually they ended up with where the Mason-Dixon line is. It spread clear across the country. California was part of the South. And so the South was a separate country. What was the North above the Mason-Dixon line became part of Canada and was part of the Commonwealth. This is the way it really happened. But the CIA changed it because they wanted the United States to be able to beat Germany in World War II. So,
interesting.
In the real timeline, Germany won World War II.
Okay.
In the timeline that they messed with, the German people in Antarctica still won World War II. They were unable to stop that. So, they also found out that timelines are sentient beings. And that you can only shift them so far before they will shift you back.
Okay.
That was why they couldn't get rid of the Germans in Antarctica.
Mm-hmm.
Those people were meant to go into space.
Okay.
And they could only do it if some part of their culture actually won the war. So this is why people think there's such thing as fate, is because the timeline itself is sentient. It does not split every time you pick your nose. It's a fairly constant thing. There are also people who think that every time you turn around, you're switching timelines. A timeline has a frequency of its own, and everyone who lives in that timeline shares that frequency. Now, within that, there are highs and lows that are the dimensions. And when you're on a dimension, when you're on its exact frequency, it's physical, just like 3D is for us. there are alternate realities. There is one where the German nation won World War II, and they're a bit of a control freak place. I have been there, but because I am of the frequency of this timeline, everything I saw was like looking through a kaleidoscope. Your brain can't function in an alternate timeline.
Montauk was about finding what people with psionic abilities could do with the chair. They had set it up with a computer and a recording device and a space for the event horizon. It creates a portal, but where you go depends on the intentions and abilities of the person in the chair.
It looks like an old style airplane seat, and it's an almond color, and it has electrodes where your shoulder blades would be. I was short enough that I was 6 when they put me in it. They had to put me on a peach box for my shoulders to reach the electrodes. And they strap you in, and they turn on the tunnel, and you're facing the tunnel, and the tunnel forms a wormhole, and the target that they want you to reach is at the end, and you're supposed to stay in the middle and focus on the tunnel, because the sides of the wormhole form loops, and they reach in and grab at you, and if one gets you, you end up off on another stream. And it's really hard. In those days, it was really hard for them to find you. So they would get really pissed if you didn't follow directions. And we went after Mind Fracture. So they had us to the point we were desensitized to a lot of the things that they used on us.
And there were drugs involved. I don't remember which drugs, but I remember having to rise above the drug to be able to function. And sometimes not knowing what was real and what wasn't. And that's made filtering the memories very difficult, which I think was their intention, was that if I remembered, I would just sound crazy. So they did use a memory wipe technology that they wanted us to never remember this. So each altar has its own set of codes to wake it up, to do its task, to self-destruct if it remembers, and to go back to sleep.
When it's off, it's just black and white stripes. When it's on, it's this energy that it's like a gray and white and black stripes that are alive, and they wiggle and they reach for you, and you have to avoid them. And then if you're not paying attention to the target, you'll see the tunnel branching, and you'll get sucked down a branch. And that gets scary because they don't always find you right away, which I was trying to get away from them. So they didn't know there are portals between dimensions, that you can travel through the same wormhole if you know they're there. And I was trying to escape from them, so I would find the portal. The chair doesn't go by a computer program. They have a program to run the wormhole in the tunnel, but it operates by the psychic ability of the person in it. And boys are more left brain and more linear because of the testosterone. And girls are more right brain and intuitive and more likely to see the portals between the dimensions. Now, different portals go to different places, so you're kind of taking potluck where you're going to end up. But it's better than being tortured. As long as you're going up, anywhere is better than Langley was. Apparently, so many girls went multidimensional like I did that when they set up the actual Montauk project, they only had boys. And I may be part of the reason why. The place I went through time was a general store in about 1888, and I was supposed to steal an apple from a display basket and not get caught and not eat it and come back with it. They were testing the butterfly effect to find out how much they could change time in the past without changing the present. And I was supposed to report on what had changed in between. You know, was somebody missing? That sort of thing.
They make it look like this time tunnel trip is just you're there and you're back. And it looks that way to the person in the chair. But to everybody else, just the simple going and coming back takes about 3 weeks. But at Montauk, they discovered that I can travel interdimensionally. And when I'm hooked up to a computer that's controlling the process. So it's not me by myself. By myself, yes, I can go interdimensionally. But with the addition of the technology, I can take physical objects with me. Turns out hyperspace drive requires a navigator to make sure that when you come out, that there are no organic life forms stuck inside inorganic objects like walls and floors. And that's a real problem in these programs. Remember the USS Eldridge, all of those humans who were stuck in the wall and the floors? The ship from the Philadelphia experiment. That was where humans realized that this technology worked, but you had to have a navigator. Even in these programs, most of us humans cannot do that. I'm only able to do that because of the specific Draco DNA they attached to me. That intervention is why I'm a navigator in space. But they discovered that at Montauk because I'd had enough of this shit. I'd been tortured for 1.5 years. I come to Montauk, I'm still being tortured. And they're expecting me to do stuff that makes no sense to me. Due to the nature of reality, there are portals between this dimension and others. And I could see the portals in the ceiling that went to other dimensions. So instead of going to the target in front of me, I would go up through the ceiling somewhere else. I usually ended up in an orc village.
That felt very physical, but the people were orcs and wore brown clothes, and they were very kind to me because my clothing didn't come with me. So my clothing was still in the chair and I wasn't, and I would be naked when I got there, and they would bring out some sort of blanket and wrap it around me. I was a lot smaller than they were, and they treated me very kindly. the way people describe orcs in some of these games, like they're horrible monsters. I didn't experience that, but they're an other dimensional race. The other places I went, I went somewhere that was like being in a kaleidoscope. I don't know what level it was or what it was supposed to be, because my brain interpreted it as just light meshing together. And they found me there right away, pulled me back. I have seen creatures that look like eyeballs that fly under their own power, and they're carnivorous. I've seen a flower that is neon white with blood red veins for the plant and through the leaves, and the petals are blood red, and the face side of it is a black portal. Anyway, if you get sucked into it, you have no idea where you're going, and the plant will feed off your energies. I saw the opportunity to escape, and that's what I was trying to do. And I went interdimensional, and they had an extraterrestrial there, a Draco warrior assigned to the project at Montauk, and he would go interdimensional and hunt my ass down and drag me back.
I understand their race is called Turrican, and they are descended from a turtle-looking race. They still have the shell on their back. They don't have wings. They're about 9 feet tall, so they're shorter than the Alpha Drax. And this particular one was male and brown, and he would just sit in a corner and observe.
I didn't know his name. He had a deep voice, broad. He had claws. I should have been scared of him, but I wasn't. I was more scared of the humans that were there. And about the 8th or 9th time this happened, the humans running Montauk wanted to toss me in the incinerator as useless, because I wasn't cooperating with them at all. And this Draco stood up, literally stood up in the corner and said, no, she's worth more than all the rest put together. And so he put a Draco chip into me then so that he could track me anywhere I went. And at that point, I knew there was no escape because I'm chipped. So I started cooperating. I did their project they wanted. And then they sent me back to Langley. And once I was back to Langley, then they started programming the altars. They send you to Montauk first so that it would give it time to become a person. And once it's to that stage, they find it, they dig it up, they teach it, they train it to be a person, they train it to do certain jobs, give it certain skills, and then they move on to the next one. Well, there's 2,200 of them, and of the 31 that I've reintegrated, I'd say 16 of them were just these stored traumas that never had been turned into people. So this is how I have the memories of what they did to me. This entire program was set up to activate and weaponize psychic abilities. And they had learned it from the Illuminati, that this was the only effective way to make sure that you had a psionic weapon, because otherwise the child would never learn to activate the military useful abilities. You had to be in a situation where
your life was in danger and you had no actual way to protect yourself other than the psychic abilities. And that was when they would pop up. Dr. Green would play the daisy game where he would pull the petals off the daisy, love you not. And if it was love you at the end, then you were left alone. If it was love you not, he'd shoot you and you'd wake up in the regen tank. Sometimes they would leave you in the regen tank because it was a sensory deprivation tank. And they had to pay attention to when you woke up. I mean, the monitor on it would tell them you were awake, but if they weren't there in the room, they wouldn't know. So you'd be in there for a while and you know, there's no light because it's a gel, there's no sensation. And you're just like, did they let me stay dead this time? If you refused an assignment, you would be put into an electric chair and electrocuted. And then put in the regen tank. So turning down an assignment was not acceptable. And assignments would be things like shooting each other or killing animals with your mind, or it's not exactly remote viewing if it's telepathy involved, but it's along the same lines. You're remote viewing a situation and reading the mind of the person there. And I was better at reading their emotional state, but that wasn't what they wanted. They wanted me to give the words the guy was thinking and just repeat what I heard even if I didn't understand it. I just wasn't good at it, so I was electrocuted several times.
I was taught how to destroy electronics with my mind. I was taught how to kill people with my mind. I was taught how to kill people with weapons.
One of the things that I am able to do is create heat, and they taught me or activated the ability to heat up cerebral spinal fluid in the third ventricle of the brain and use that to kill the person who is attacking me. And later on in training, there would be things that I would refuse to do, and they would just shoot me. And when they would bring me back, they would put me back in the same situation and say, well, now you have to do it.
We would be set against each other where we had to have shielding to protect from each other. And it was, the orders were only one of us was coming out of the room alive. And there might be 5 of us in the room. And it was no holds barred, use whatever you got. Only one of you is coming out alive. We were forced into killing each other. And there were no alliances. You did what you had to do, and you survived, and you got out. Or you didn't. And you ended up in the regeneration tank, and however long it took to recover from the injuries, you'd be in there, and then it would be back to the same thing because you didn't pass. Yeah. They might make you pass 5 or 6 times.
Right.
Or 30. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. You might be in the middle of another training, and they'll pull you out for a couple of days for something else. There was no structure. There was no continuity. It was constant chaos. Right. We were never allowed to be on solid footing. We were always at their whim. As in, we were not people who mattered. We were assets. We were tools. They kept reinforcing the idea that they owned us and they could do whatever the hell they wanted to us. Now, one of the skills that I had was the ability to blow people's heads up or stop their hearts. And I practiced this on the idiots that were running the program. That was when they found out I could do it, was because I did it to them. And they were not happy coming out of the regen tank. They weren't happy about coming out of the regen tank at all. You remember how you were killed, and you remember what it felt like. And who did it. And so the anger levels get really high. And we were not allowed to be angry, except at some point you figured out that that anger would power the psionics weapons. You could channel that anger into the ability. And that was like a major breakthrough. They gave the impression they were angry with me, but they may or may not have been. They lied a lot. They would tell you, oh, if you do this, then we'll let you have that, and then you'd never get it. I was taught how to be a female assassin without getting caught. And part of that is the ninja invisibility. You put up a field from your own chi that makes it where people don't even see you. I have memories of an assassin alter who walks out of a hotel room stark naked, covered in her victim's blood. They look right through her like she's not there. I have no idea how she pulls this off. But I've seen her do it more than once. Once the first altar was activated, I've had others almost like dominoes. The ones that were close to it they start by, I wake up in that altar with it active and watch what it does with the inability to affect what it does.
Okay.
That means they can pull up an altar that I don't have memory with. And because they take me with portal tech and bring me back, I don't even have a missing time period. And yet I have bits of memories from some of them. So I have some idea of what I've been used for. And it's mostly been off planet, but sometimes it's been on planet. It's like I have no control over my life. I have control over this altar and not even all of that. So when I hear about other people talking about they have free will, I'm like, doesn't apply to me. And then they think, well, it's just depression. I go, no, it's my personal reality. I don't have free will. I am owned. Okay, I was 9 years old, and I was sent to Mars with a group of kids within a couple of years of my age. We were the survivors. A Department of Defense agent referred to it as the class of Langley of 64. This is how they talk about us. Number 5 was one of the ones that survived along with me. And we were one of the group that was sent from the jump gate on Long Island, New York, to Mars. It's a permanent wormhole installation. And it's not the Empire State Building. It's not that big. If I remember, it's somewhere between 4 and 6 stories. And it's right on the river, the Hudson. And you can look from the front door and see a bridge over the river.
The only times I was ever out of that floor were when I was taken to Montauk and brought back, and then when we left to go to New York. At that one trip, there were, I think, 8 or 9 of us in the elevator that turned into the jump room. We went into this building, and we were still in our pajamas. And we went into the elevator, and they said, okay, that's enough. and they had one operator that ran the panel, and there was a panel for regular elevator, and there was a slide, and there was a panel for the jump gate. It was in an actual elevator in a building on Long Island in New York. And we were told to huddle in the middle and not touch the edges, not touch the walls. Because the walls kind of morphed into a time tunnel look.
Sure.
It wasn't until the walls appeared to dissolve that we actually hung on to each other. And that was more self-protection.
Okay, when they turned it on, we were in the middle and the walls basically went transparent. And we could see the wormhole. And it was like a tunnel with loops that were grabbing at us. And if we were too close to the edge, it would have pulled us out. It lasts a little longer or shorter based on where we are relative to each other in our orbits. Okay. There are times that Earth and Mars are very close, and there are times that we're on opposite sides of the solar system. Now, when I went through it, I don't know what the orbit was at the time, but it took about 20 minutes to get there. Also, you should know that the jump gates, and there's more than one, are part of what's called Project Pegasus. So this is a legitimate CIA operation. And at least 2 of the jump gates were active in 1964. And when we get to Mars, we go out to the back, and there's a big sign that says Willkommen in Mars in German. And you see this desk with this woman there, and she can be a cranky person.